If you wanted to destroy your own country, you wouldn't need an invasion. You wouldn't need a natural disaster. You would just need a series of decisions. Decisions that hollow out your institutions, drain your workforce, lock your economy into a dependency you can't escape, and then commit to a war that ties all of it together. At each step, things would still look stable, until suddenly they don't. Because this isn't the story of a country that was defeated from the outside. This is the story of one that did it to itself. And what makes it worth the next few minutes of your time is that we can trace every single step, the moment it started, the mechanism that made each stage worse, and the point of no return that almost nobody saw coming. This is Russia in 2026, and this is exactly how it happened. If that first line landed, hit like right now, because this breakdown only gets heavier from here. Because by the end of this video, you're going to see a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history whenever a powerful country quietly talks itself into its own decline, and almost nobody watching from the inside notices until it's already too late to reverse. Russia entered the 21st century with advantages most countries could only dream about: the world's largest landmass, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, the biggest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Beneath its soil sat oil, gas, metals, and rare materials the modern world still can't function without. Above ground sat a population shaped by generations of intensive technical education, engineers, scientists, mathematicians, a genuine intellectual inheritance built over decades. The 1990s had been brutal. The Soviet collapse shredded the economy, crushed living standards, and left the country in shock. Life expectancy fell. Savings evaporated overnight. An entire generation watched the state that had defined their whole lives simply disappear from under them. But by the early 2000s, something had shifted. Energy prices were climbing. Foreign capital was available. Globalization was accelerating. For a brief window, Russia looked like it might follow the same path as other post-Soviet states that eventually stabilized into functioning market economies with real institutions behind them. Russia had a rare opening, the kind that comes along maybe once in a generation, to build something genuinely durable. A diversified economy, functioning institutions, integration into international systems that reward long-term development. Instead, it built something else entirely. Not a state designed to grow, a state designed to control. And here's the part worth sitting with. The man who built it didn't inherit a doomed country. Vladimir Putin consolidated a system that, step by step, converted Russia's extraordinary starting advantages into something far more fragile than most outsiders were willing to admit. It didn't happen in one catastrophic moment. It never does. It happened through a sequence of decisions, each rational in isolation, each quietly poisonous in the long run. By the time the damage became visible, the door had already been closing for years. So if you wanted to destroy a country like this, one with nuclear weapons, natural resources, and a permanent seat at the biggest table in the world, you wouldn't attack it from the outside. You'd have to convince it to do the job itself. Here's how, step by step. Step one is the one nobody notices at the time. You take a functioning, if chaotic, system, and you make it answer to just one person. Russia, in 2003, had a moment that clarified everything. A company called Yukos, at the time one of the largest oil producers in the country, was systematically dismantled by the Russian state. Its CEO was arrested, tried, and imprisoned. The legal justifications were elaborate. The message was simple. In Russia, large-scale economic power was conditional. It existed at the pleasure of the Kremlin, and it could be revoked without warning. Think about what that single case actually taught an entire generation of Russian business leaders. It didn't matter how well you ran your company, how many jobs you created, or how clean your books were. What mattered was whether you stayed politically useful and whether you ever looked like you might build an independent base of power. One arrest did more to shape Russian capitalism than a decade of economic policy ever could. Every business leader, every regional governor, every senior official in the country received that message and adjusted accordingly. Scholars who study this period have a term for what Russia built: patronal politics, a system where formal law does exist. There are courts, regulators, rules, but decisive. Power runs through informal networks of personal loyalty. Who do you owe? Who protects you? Who can destroy you? In a system like that, independence becomes a liability. A regional leader with genuine popular support becomes a threat. An official who delivers uncomfortable truths becomes a problem. A court that rules against the Kremlin becomes an anomaly to be corrected. And this creates a specific, devastating administrative failure, one that would matter enormously later when Russia needed to adapt fast. When officials are rewarded for loyalty and punished for honesty, the entire apparatus of government learns to perform success rather than achieve it. Problems don't get solved. They get reassigned, relabeled, and buried. The state can appear to function smoothly right up until the moment it needs to respond to something it didn't see coming. In 2020, constitutional changes deepened this further. Presidential authority was strengthened. Checks were weakened. The state became increasingly dependent on the survival instincts and judgment of a single man. Great powers don't work like that. They build systems that outlast leaders. Russia built a state that depended on one. And here's what happens when you run a country like that long enough. You start making decisions that no one around you will push back on. Think about what that actually does to decision-making at the very top. In a healthy system, a leader hears bad news early, while there's still time to change course. In a patronal system, bad news becomes dangerous to deliver. The people closest to power learn to filter what reaches the top, softening the failures, inflating the successes, until the person making the biggest decisions in the country is working from a picture that's been quietly edited by everyone beneath him. That's not a hypothetical risk. It's a structural feature of exactly the kind of system Russia spent 2 decades building, which leads directly to the money. Step 2 is where the cash flows in, and it's where the trap gets set. Russia didn't just happen to be oil and gas dependent. Its political system learned to rely on the structure of resource rents and then shape the entire economy around that structure. Here's why that matters. In a diversified economy, wealth comes from millions of independent decisions, firms competing, experimenting, failing, and trying again. That kind of dynamism generates something beyond money. It generates a class of people with capital, expertise, and the habit of autonomy. It generates institutions, courts that enforce contracts, regulators that set standards, universities that pipeline talent into new industries. In a resource economy, the state sits on the pipe. Wealth flows through choke points. It controls pipelines, export terminals, state-linked firms. Loyalty gets rewarded with access. Disobedience gets punished by cutting it off. Politically convenient, but economically fragile. When law gets applied selectively rather than impartially, economic actors plan defensively. Long-term investment becomes irrational when property rights aren't secure. Innovation becomes dangerous when success can attract the attention of people who might simply take it. The safest strategy in that environment becomes build small, stay invisible, keep your assets liquid, and keep your options abroad. Multiply that calculation across millions of individual entrepreneurs and engineers, and you get an economy that quietly optimizes for caution instead of ambition. Nobody builds the next generation of factories when the safest move is to keep your money somewhere a court order can't reach it. That single incentive, repeated across 2 decades, shaped the character of an entire national economy far more than any single piece of legislation ever could. The result is a country that produces brilliant scientists and then struggles to turn their work into actual industries. Russia's research and development spending stayed well below the levels of leading innovation economies throughout this entire period. Technology doesn't get commanded into existence. It gets built by open institutions, long timelines, and fierce competition, none of which Russia's system was particularly good at protecting. And then there was the energy picture. By the time the invasion began, Europe was still deeply reliant on Russian gas. That leverage felt like strength. We'll come back to what happened to it, because the answer is one of the most dramatic reversals in modern economic history. By the mid-2010s, the structural problems were already being flagged in international assessments. Limited diversification, a dominant state, a business environment that discouraged exactly the long-term risk-taking that drives modern growth. Russia wasn't broken, just wasn't building. And then, in February of 2022, it made a decision that turned every one of those quiet vulnerabilities into an open emergency, simultaneously. The invasion of Ukraine didn't create Russia's problems. It exposed them and then locked them in. From the very first week, costs started compounding in ways the Kremlin's planning clearly hadn't accounted for. Western sanctions hit hard and fast. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian sovereign assets held abroad, money the central bank had accumulated for exactly this kind of crisis, were frozen, unusable. Export controls targeted something even more damaging than trade, access to the future. Advanced electronics, precision manufacturing tools, semiconductors, the components modern weapon systems and modern economies actually run on. Russia found workarounds through gray channels and parallel imports. But a workaround isn't a development strategy. It's a confession of dependency. Picture what that actually looks like on a factory floor. A defense plant that used to order a precision component from Germany now has to source it through a third country at a markup with a longer wait and no guarantee of consistent quality. Multiply that, friction across thousands of components and thousands of factories, and you get an economy quietly bleeding efficiency in ways that never show up in a single dramatic headline, only in the slow accumulation of delays, defects, and rising costs. Meanwhile, the military spending numbers were extraordinary. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia's military expenditure hit roughly $149 billion in 2024. That was about 7% of the entire economy and 19% of all government spending. By 2025, defense and security spending combined were consuming somewhere around 40% of Russia's total federal budget, more than education, healthcare, social policy, and direct economic investment combined. Let that sit for a second. Roughly 4 out of every 10 rubles the Russian government spent went toward the war machine. To control the inflation all of that spending was generating, which climbed toward double digits, Russia's central bank pushed its key interest rate up to 21% at its peak, a multi-decade record. Businesses couldn't borrow. Investment contracted. The economy that looked like it was growing, war-fueled GDP growth of over 4% in 2024, began grinding toward a halt. By 2025, real GDP growth had collapsed to roughly 0.5% to 1%, according to IMF estimates, with World Bank projections for 2026 and 2027 holding at around the same level. The war looked like it was working. Underneath, Russia was becoming poor in every way that matters for the long run, and it was about to lose something far more valuable than money. If this breakdown is landing for you, make sure you're subscribed right now, because what comes next stops being a story about geopolitics and starts being a story about people. And these are numbers the Kremlin absolutely does not want you to see. Here's the part that rarely makes the front page. While the tanks rolled, the sanctions hit, and the budgets ballooned, Russia was quietly losing the one resource that no oil revenue could ever replace: its people, its best people. Since February 2022, somewhere between 550 and 850,000 Russians have left and not returned. That figure almost certainly undercounts the real number, since Russian statistics only capture those who formally deregister before leaving. But the raw number isn't even the most important part. Who left is. The average age of the first emigration wave was 32. Roughly 86% held university degrees, nearly triple the national average. Russia's own government data confirmed that roughly 100,000 IT workers, around 10% of the entire sector, departed and didn't come back. In the first weeks after the invasion alone, industry estimates put departing tech workers somewhere between 50 and 70,000, with tens of thousands more expected to follow. These weren't people approaching retirement. They were engineers, researchers, startup founders, coders, the exact segment any modern economy depends on for innovation, productivity, and connection to the global knowledge economy. Picture what that actually looks like inside a single company. A mid-sized Russian software firm loses its lead architect, then 2 of its best engineers follow within months, chasing the same opportunity abroad. The firm doesn't collapse overnight. It just quietly stops competing for the contracts it used to win, and nobody outside that office ever hears about it. Multiply that story across an entire sector, and you get a labor exodus that barely makes headlines, but reshapes an entire economy's ceiling. And when they left, they didn't just take their savings. They took their networks, their relationships with European research institutions and global tech firms, the companies they were about to build, the patents they hadn't filed yet. That kind of loss doesn't show up in a single year's GDP data. It compounds across decades. One of the most rigorous independent research programs tracking this exodus found that as of 2024, only around 8% of immigrants were returning per year. The rest weren't coming back, not without fundamental political change. Of those who did briefly return, roughly 80% left again within a year. The ones abroad are staying abroad. Think about what an 8% annual return rate actually implies over 10 or 15 years. It means the overwhelming majority of an entire cohort of the country's most educated young professionals is simply gone, permanently, from the labor force. Russia will need to rebuild anything resembling a modern economy once the war eventually ends. That's not a temporary dip in a graph. That's a hole in the workforce that will still be visible in national statistics decades from now. Meanwhile, Russia's underlying demographic crisis, already severe before the war, has been accelerating. The country's natural population declined by nearly 600,000 people in 2024 alone, and that trend continued into 2025. Russia's statistics agency actually stopped publishing regular monthly birth and death data partway through last year. By the end of 2023, Russia's own Academy of Sciences reported a labor deficit of nearly 5 million workers, and with unemployment hovering near historic lows of around 2%, that might sound like a tight, healthy economy. It isn't. It means the military, the defense complex, and the civilian sector are all competing for the exact same shrinking pool of workers simultaneously, and none of them are winning. The Kremlin's answer has largely been to just recruit more soldiers, offering signing bonuses that have climbed steadily since 2022, pulling yet more working-age men out of the civilian economy every single month. At peak recruitment, the army was reportedly drawing down 30 to 35,000 workers from the civilian labor pool monthly. That's not a number any economy absorbs without long-term damage. There's a term for what happens when all of this runs at once, a demographic fuse. Mistakes become harder to repair. Recovery becomes structurally more difficult. The window for reversal gets shorter with every year that passes. Which brings us to what Russia lost in the outside world and why rebuilding it will take longer than almost anyone is currently acknowledging. It wasn't just money that got frozen, it was trust. And trust turns out to be a form of infrastructure, one that takes generations to build and weeks to destroy. After February 2022, Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe, severing its citizens from decades of supranational legal protections. The UN General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. Academic exchanges collapsed. Foreign students stopped coming. Global firms that had spent years building Russian operations pulled out entirely. Association with Russia became politically toxic across much of the world, not just in government, but in markets, in science, in culture. Consider what that actually costs a country over a generation. A physics researcher who used to co-author papers with European colleagues now works in isolation. A university that used to attract international students now struggles to fill seats. A startup that once dreamed of a Berlin or London office now has no realistic path there. None of these losses show up as a single number on a balance sheet. They show up decades later as a country that simply isn't part of the conversations where the future gets decided. The energy picture shifted just as dramatically. Europe moved aggressively to reduce its dependence on Russian fossil fuels. The EU's share of Russian gas imports collapsed between 2021 and 2024, a structural economic relationship reframed almost overnight as a strategic liability and dismantled on an accelerated timeline. Russia rerouted oil where it could. Tankers are flexible, but pipelines are not. They're built for specific geography, specific partners, and they require long-term commitment from buyers who now understand exactly how exposed they've been. New routes take years, and they require trust that Russia had already spent. As options narrowed, dependencies deepened. Isolation doesn't produce self-sufficiency. It produces reliance on a smaller circle of partners, partners who know they're your only option and price accordingly. Russia moved from selling energy into competitive global markets to negotiating from an increasingly weak position with fewer buyers and fewer alternatives. What the Kremlin framed as sovereignty, operating outside Western rules, produced the opposite effect in practice. Fewer choices, more expensive inputs, a narrowing circle of allies, none of whom are positioned to replace what Russia had lost. And here's what the economic model looked like from the inside. A wartime economy can look from the outside like a functioning economy. Factories run, unemployment stays low, headline growth for a time holds up. That is exactly what happened in Russia through 2023 and 2024. State cash poured into defense production, and GDP responded. Some commentators even called it resilience. But there's a question you have to ask about any economy. What is it actually producing? Tanks and artillery shells don't compound. They get consumed. They don't generate supply chains, exports, or the knowledge clusters that build long-term national strength. When the state becomes the dominant buyer and classifies an increasing share of what it's purchasing, firms learn to satisfy bureaucratic requirements rather than global markets. Quantity replaces quality, secrecy expands. Corruption, always present, becomes harder to detect and easier to deny. Compare that to what a competitive, export-driven economy actually looks like. Firms there survive by satisfying customers who have other options, which forces constant improvement. A defense-dominated economy has exactly one customer, the state, and that customer doesn't reward efficiency the way a competitive market does. It rewards whoever can hit the delivery deadline, regardless of what corners got cut to get there. Over a few years, that difference is invisible. Over a decade, it's the difference between an economy that keeps improving and one that quietly stops. And then the bill comes due. By 2025, the IMF put GDP growth at roughly 0.5% to 1%. World Bank projections through 2026 and 2027 sit at around the same level, and those assume no further deterioration. Meanwhile, defense and security spending were consuming close to 40% of the federal budget, squeezing the civilian economy from every direction at once. Russia's own central bank governor has been uncharacteristically candid about the structural pressures, high rates, labor shortages, overheated demand chasing a supply base that simply can't expand fast enough. The economy, in her own framing, is returning to a balanced growth path. What that actually means is that the artificial acceleration driven by war spending is ending, and what's underneath is considerably slower. The system can carry this burden for years. Authoritarian governments often appear strongest at exactly the moment their foundations are most compromised. But the cumulative costs accumulate in demography, in technology, and institutional capacity. And at some point, the gap between what the system presents and what it actually is becomes impossible to close. So here's what makes this story different from most geopolitical collapses. There was no single catastrophe, no moment where everything fell apart at once, no obvious turning point where you could say that's exactly where it went wrong. Instead, there was a sequence. Trade institutions for control, The system becomes blind to its own failures. Build the economy around oil so it becomes rigid and dependent. Commit to an open-ended war, and the costs compound. No single reversal could undo what the sequence had built. Picture that chain as a set of dominoes standing far apart from each other, close enough that each one can still knock over the next, but spread across 2 decades instead of 2 seconds. That's the actual shape of this collapse. Nobody watching in real time could point to the moment it became irreversible, because from the inside, every single step looked survivable on its own. That's what makes this, in a specific and measurable sense, a century-scale problem. Modern national power gets built by generations, through institutions that outlast individual leaders, through human capital that takes decades to develop, through trust that accumulates slowly in legal systems and international frameworks. When you degrade all of those simultaneously, you don't set a country back a few years. You change its entire trajectory. Compare that to how quickly a war can theoretically end, how quickly a sanctions regime can theoretically be lifted, how quickly a diplomatic relationship can theoretically be repaired. Every one of those processes could, in principle, move fast if the political will existed on all sides. The workforce that already left the country and the generation of children now growing up without the teachers and scientists who would have trained them cannot be summoned back on the same kind of timeline, no matter how much political will exists. Russia in 2026 still has nuclear weapons. It still has vast territory and the resources beneath it. It still holds its seat at the Security Council. None of that will vanish. But survival isn't the same as strength, and resources aren't the same as capacity. The deeper damage, the part that's hardest to quantify and hardest to reverse, is to possibility itself. A war can end, sanctions can shift, trade routes can be rebuilt. But demographic decline, institutional erosion, and the selective loss of an entire generation of high-skilled workers does not reverse quickly. The rebuilding of trust inside Russian society and between Russia and the outside world is slower still. Russia began the 21st century with extraordinary starting capital. What the Putin era converted that capital into, step by step, decision by decision, was a system increasingly designed to consume its own future. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone watching from outside Russia's borders. None of the individual decisions in this sequence looked reckless at the time they were made. Consolidating power looked like stability. Leaning on energy exports looked like a sound national strategy. Even the decision to invade Ukraine, whatever. So here's our question for you. Do you think Russia can actually reverse this? Is structural recovery even possible at this point, or has too much already compounded? Take a moment before you answer, because the honest response probably isn't a simple yes or no. Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe, because this story isn't finished, not by a long way. And if you've made it this far, you now understand something about this war that most headlines never get into. The damage that doesn't show up on a battlefield map at all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.